In this lecture, we'll complete our discussion of cast shadows. We'll cover oblique light coming from both the front and the rear of objects. We'll also discuss artificial light. Before we do, let's return to side light and a single post in the desert. A ray of light glances the post's top and continues to the ground. To draw the shadow, we extend a horizontal at a 90-degree angle from the post base to intersect the ray at ground level. The shadow has two components: angle or direction, and length. The line coming from the base of the vertical post determines the direction or angle of the shadow, here 90 degrees. The light ray determines length. Oblique light gets a little more complicated, but these two principles apply. Remembering this can stave off confusion. Let's start with oblique light from the front. This means the cast shadows will recede into space. Draw along here. Once again, try to put things approximately where I do. That way you'll have room for everything we'll draw. Start with a single pole out in the desert with a mid-ish horizon. We'll imagine light coming from the left behind us, so the shadow will recede at an angle from the post base to the right. This establishes the light and shadow's direction. If you extend the line of the shadow to the horizon, you get a new kind of vanishing point, a shadow vanishing point. Add a light ray. This establishes the angle the light travels from its source. The point at which the light ray traverses a shadow defines the shadow's length. Same idea as side light. As the angle of the ray rotates toward the vertical, the shadow gets shorter. As it moves toward the horizontal, longer. There's a second new kind of point we'll use here, a shadow trace point. That's where the light ray would intersect a 90-degree vertical passing through the shadow vanishing point. We're actually going to draw a block in two-point perspective with its shadow, but we'll do this one post at a time. Let's add a second post. Same size as the first, but farther back in space. To do this, we'll need a right vanishing point for the posts. Place it to the left of the shadow vanishing point. Then vanish the top and bottom of the existing post back toward the right vanishing point. Then add a new post behind the first, and erase the two construction lines receding to the right vanishing point. Then draw the second post shadow using the shadow vanishing point and trace point. Draw a line from the base of the new post toward the shadow vanishing point to establish its angle. Then a line from the top of the new post toward the shadow trace point. This establishes the shadow's length. Erase the two new construction lines. Next, we'll add another post, the back corner of the block. We'll need a left vanishing point. Then vanish the right post back toward that point and add the post. Erase the construction lines. From the base of the new post, draw its receding shadow toward the shadow vanishing point. Then draw a ray from the top of the post toward the shadow trace point. You've defined the angle and length of this post shadow. All the shadow directions converge toward the same point, the shadow vanishing point. All the shadow lengths are defined by rays of light converging toward the shadow trace point. We need one more post. We'll use the existing post on the left in combination with the right and left vanishing points to locate this. Erase the construction lines. We won't need the shadow of the post on the left. It'll fall in the interior of the block, and our goal is a solid block with its shadow. If we were constructing something like a table, we'd add this. Now, connect the post to get a transparent block. To get the shadow of the block, we need to draw the shadow of the long edge receding to the right. We get this by connecting the first two posts' shadows. Then connect the third post shadow to draw the top right rear edge's shadow. Erase the internal shadow construction line, then the portion of the shadow we won't see if the block's opaque, and erase the internal construction lines. You could add value to all the planes. Good idea to lighten all the lines first, erase them back so they're just visible. The planes will feel more volumetric if they're not bound by line. If the light's coming from the left, depending on its elevation, the left-facing plane or the top plane will get the most light. I'll go with the left plane, top next, right plane least. We also want to think hierarchically. If I want people to pay attention to the block, I locate the highest contrast in the block and in its relationship to the ground. I also make sure that the contrast in the two ground shapes is minimal in comparison. We generally don't want lots of contrast between the two ground shapes, and minimal contrast between the block and the ground, and within the block too. Do this, and the edge where the ground shapes meet will pop, and the block becomes an afterthought. We can accomplish this compositional goal using different palettes. This will inflect the quality of light and will correlate with mood and emotional quality. And remember, value's relative. It's not the value per se, but the role it plays in the given value palette. What reads as a mid-light in one context could read mid-dark in another. Let's rewind what we just did, but instead of starting with a post, we'll start by constructing a block using right and left vanishing points. From the base of one vertical edge, draw an angular direction for the cast shadow. This is an artistic choice, a compositional choice. Then extend this diagonal to the horizon to establish a shadow vanishing point. The shadow length is another artistic choice. It could be short, medium, or long, up to you. To establish that length, we need a shadow trace point. Draw a vertical line through the shadow vanishing point. Establish the length of the first shadow. Then project a line from the top of the vertical through the shadow's end to intersect the vertical trace. The point of intersection will be the shadow trace point. Then relate the shadows of all vertical edges to these 2 points. Erase the construction lines and define the cast shadow shape. Next, establish a value structure for the drawing, and you want to think about mood and compositional value and hierarchy. It's worth noting that as we move laterally from the shadow vanishing and trace points, the cast shadows get longer and the angle of the shadow to the vertical edge becomes more obtuse. As we move closer, the shadows get shorter and the angle more acute. I'd suggest reinforcing what you've just learned by playing around with it. Try light from the right. It will work the same way. You could also modify the object. Try a table, then a block on another block, and try cones and cylinders too. Let's look at oblique light coming from behind the object. This means the cast shadow will project forward in space. Start with a block, like the one we drew earlier. Erase the construction lines. From the central vertical's base, draw a line to represent the cast shadow's direction and length. Extend this back to the horizon to locate the shadow vanishing point. Draw a vertical trace through this point. From the tip of the cast shadow, extend a line through the top of the central vertical and continue along this diagonal to intersect the vertical trace. The point of intersection is the shadow trace point. Line up the shadow vanishing point with the base of the far left vertical edge. Project a line forward in space from the vertical's base along this diagonal. This defines the shadow's angle. Then, line up the shadow trace point with the top of the vertical edge and project forward to intersect the first line. This defines the shadow's length. Erase your construction lines. Follow the same procedures on the right edge. Add the lines representing the shadows of the top left and right front edges of the block, and erase the internal construction line to complete the shadow. Here, as we move laterally from the shadow vanishing and trace points, the cast shadows get longer. But in contrast to light from the front, here the angle of the shadow to the vertical edge becomes more acute with distance. As we move closer, the shadows get shorter, the angle's more obtuse. Play around with this too, like you did with light from the front, and play with the system itself. You could imagine a large light source behind the objects with rays projecting both right and left from a central trace point. Our last type of light is artificial light. In many ways, this combines aspects of the various types of light we've studied so far. We'll draw an interior or room with a light source, like a light bulb suspended from the ceiling. We'll locate the shadow vanishing point directly below the light source on the ground plane. In this situation, the shadows of objects in front of the shadow vanishing point will project forward in space in front of the object. Objects behind the shadow vanishing point will project back, behind the object. An object straddling the shadow vanishing point will project horizontally away from the shadow vanishing point. I'd like you to use a sheet of 22 by 30 inch paper. Put it on your drawing board in the landscape position and lightly draw an 18 by 24 inch rectangle centered in the page. The drawing will be 18 by 24. The extra space will allow us to position right and left vanishing points outside the format shape. This will help us avoid distortion. First, draw a horizon line across the page at about 2/3 of the way up. If you're measuring, make it 13 inches off the bottom of the page, or 11 from the bottom of the format. Add a central vanishing point. Start with a wideish back wall. Mine's 4.5 by 10. It's vertically centered on the page and straddles the horizon so that 2.5 inches fall below and 2.5 inches above the horizon. Use the central vanishing point to draw the walls, floor, and ceiling. Locate the light source in the ceiling. Mine's positioned about 2.25 inches from the top of the page. All we need is a point, like a vanishing point. Draw a vertical line through this point. The light source functions as a shadow trace point, the vertical line as a shadow trace. To find the shadow vanishing point, we have to project this point onto the ground plane. From the light source, draw a horizontal along the ceiling to the right wall, then vertically down the right wall to the floor, then horizontally across the floor to the vertical trace. The point of intersection is the shadow vanishing point. Once you've got this point, you can erase the projection lines. Now we need some objects. Let's start with a transparent two-point block in the lower right. As you remember from our discussion of two-point perspective, to limit distortion, we space the vanishing points far apart. I'll put mine on the horizon at the edges of the page. Now, construct a transparent two-point block like this one. Once you've got your block, erase the construction lines. To draw this block's shadow, we need to project a light ray glancing the top of each vertical. Next, we'll project the shadow's direction from the shadow vanishing point through the vertical's base to intersect the ray. Then we can draw the vertical shadow. Should all sound familiar. Let's start with the vertical closest to us in space. Project a line from the light source through the top. Then from the shadow vanishing point through the base. Do the same with the left vertical, then the right, and then the rear. Now erase your rays. Starting on the left, outline the shadow, then erase everything that wouldn't be visible if the block were opaque. Last, you could add some value to the cast shadow. It's worth noting how many lines we made to construct the shadow's shape. I count 35, including the horizon. That's a lot of lines. The good news is that for many purposes, eyeballing works just fine. If something feels off, then pull out a straight edge. Let's add some curvilinear solids here. I've added a cone, a cylinder, and a sphere. Let's try doing this freehand, approximating the angle so you begin to get a feel for this. We'll start with the cone. First, we'll draw a perspectival tile around the elliptical base. Then project a diagonal through the center from the shadow vanishing point and intersect this with a light ray. Then we'll draw a line from each side of the cone's elliptical base aimed at the shadow's intersection with the light ray and stop at the wall. From the point where the center line meets the wall, we'll draw a vertical to intersect the ray and connect the two sides. You can erase your construction lines and add some value. Let's project the cylinder shadow. Start out the same way. Draw a tile, find the perspectival center. Project a line from the shadow vanishing point through the base's center point and out along the ground plane. Where this line traverses the ellipse edge on the left, draw a vertical up to the top ellipse. From the light source, project a line through this point to intersect the line from the shadow vanishing point. From the shadow vanishing point, project another line along the left edge of the cylinder's base and continue forward a bit. Where this line touches the base, draw a vertical up to the top ellipse. From this point, project the line from the light source to the ground plane to intersect the line from the shadow vanishing point. Repeat this on the right side. Once you have these three lines, connect them along the curve. Then erase what you don't need. Now for the sphere. Start with a circle. Then draw a square tile in perspective around the circle. Verticals first, then top and bottom diagonals converging to the horizon, though this will be well off the page. Now we'll draw the cast shadow of the tile. Then the tile's simple armature. Then the cast shadow of the armature. So let's see how we can apply what we've just learned to things we draw in a landscape, interior, or still life. I've drawn a tree like an Italian cypress, a door with a glass pane, and a picture. We have an artificial light source above. Could be an interior light or a street light on a dark night, and a shadow vanishing point below. Start with a tree. We'll draw a perspectival rectangle encompassing the cypress. Add an armature. Then project the rectangle and armature onto the ground plane and draw the tree's shadow. The door is already rectilinear. We can project it directly onto the ground plane, then draw verticals down from the glass plane to the door's base and project them along the ground plane. Now, project light rays through the window's four corners and draw light passing through the window on the ground plane. Let's do the picture. Draw a rectangle around the picture. Project it. Draw verticals from the top of the body of the picture to the bottom of the rectangle. Project these lines forward and draw the body's shadow. Project a light ray from the low point where the spout attaches to the body of the picture to the body's shadow. Draw the spout. Project a similar point for the handle and draw the handle. Using a bounding rectangle works for all kinds of irregular forms in an artificial or oblique light. Cars, dogs, people, anything. The essential point here is that we can apply these concepts in a range of ways, from slow and precise to fast and gestural. In these last two lectures, we've looked at 5 cases of cast shadow projection. In each case, we built the shadows using vertical heights associated with the object. To construct the shadows, we determined the direction or angle of the shadow as well as its length. The shadow's direction or angle originated from the base of the vertical. The length of the shadow was determined by a light ray glancing the top of the vertical. The point where the shadow's angle and light ray intersected defined the vertical shadow. In the first case we looked at, left side light, the direction of the light and of the shadow was horizontal to the right. In right side light, the direction of the light and shadow was horizontal to the left. In both cases, the shadow's length was defined by the angle of a light ray intersecting the cast shadow's direction. The third case was oblique light from in front of the object. Here, shadows of verticals receded behind the object to a shadow vanishing point on the horizon. The length of shadows were determined by the angle of the light rays. All the rays converged to a shadow trace point located on a vertical trace directly below the shadow vanishing point. The fourth case was oblique light from behind the object. Here, shadows projected forward in space, in front of the object, from a shadow vanishing point on the horizon. The length of the shadows were determined by the angle of the light rays. All the rays converged to a shadow trace point located on a vertical trace directly above the shadow vanishing point. In this case, the point can be conceived of as being the light source itself. The fifth case was an artificial light in a room. Here, the light rays radiated outward from the light source. They glanced the tops of verticals and continued to the ground plane to intersect the shadow's angles. These angles originated in a shadow vanishing point located on the ground plane directly below the light source. The resultant shadows splay out from the center. For the light to be consistent in both oblique and artificial light, all the shadows of vertical elements must recede to the same shadow vanishing point. The lengths of all the shadows must be defined by a light source or shadow trace point located directly above or below the shadow vanishing point. In this section, we've covered single light sources. Our goal has been to understand how to draw convincing three-dimensional form from the imagination. When most people work from their imagination, this is more or less the norm. It's the clearest way to make form feel three-dimensional. That's not to say that multiple light sources are out of the question. You could take the ones we've covered and combine them. Draw a single object and project all 5 different light sources. With light coming from every side, the planes can become evenly lit. One potential effect is to make form feel less solid, less 3D, and this could be made visually interesting. There are many artists who've been interested in less than solid form. There are other occasions when multiple light sources might be of interest. One could be when the focus of the drawing is not really the object, but instead the choreography of patterns of light and shadow. Another would be when a contrast of light sources is involved. You've likely seen someone sitting by a window. The plane of their head turned into the room is lit by a warm, orangish, incandescent bulb. The plane facing the window goes blue, lit by cool exterior daylight. Especially if one's working in color, these kinds of situations can be very interesting to pursue. But in the latter case, it would likely be preferable to use direct observation as a starting point rather than perspectival constructive methods. You now know quite a bit about light, shade, and constructing shadow. There are quite a number of interesting projects that you could take on at this point. First, draw into the cast shadow drawings you've done with this and the prior lecture. You could add more objects, but certainly add value to all the planes. Of course, think about how you're using light and shade to create volume, but also think about overall mood and value palette. And remember to consider the hierarchies of contrast, how you're using value compositionally. Play with projecting shadows onto different kinds of surfaces. We did a bit of this, but there are many engaging possibilities here. Make small gestural drawings. Remember, once you understand the concept, you don't have to rule things out precisely. Imagine a series of objects in a row. Here, the small cone casts its shadow on the ground plane and then climbs up the larger cone. This in turn casts its shadow on the ground plane and climbs up and across the block. The key is to make the shadow reflect the angle or curve of the plane it falls on. One of the projects described in an earlier lecture on value involved drawing geometric solids, a sphere and a block, from observation. Now draw them from your imagination. Start with a sphere. Draw a format shape and make a horizontal division in the format. You've just drawn a tabletop with a wall behind it. Draw a circle. That'll be your sphere. Now use value to create mood, hierarchy, and three-dimensional form. Remember the steps of light on a sphere we discussed in the first lecture on value. Use those 9 steps: highlight, light, halftone, penumbra, umbra, reflected light, reflected shadow, cast shadow, and light from the object reflected into the shadow. Do the same thing with the block and a cone. A cylinder would be good too. Then try a still life of several of these put together, all from your imagination. Try lining them up along the horizontal. Imagine light from the side so that each object casts a shadow on the next. In terms of compositional value, you'll generally want the least contrast among the large ground shapes and the greatest contrast in your objects and their relationship to the ground. Procedurally, it's a good idea to attend to the value of the ground shapes first, the objects and cast shadows second. Just like in life, you can't put a table on the floor unless you have a floor. You can't put a bowl on the table unless you have the table. Can't put fruit in the bowl unless you have a bowl. While there are no rules, it's generally much easier to assign values to the tabletop and walls first, then the objects and their shadows. Work large to small, general to specific. Also, consider doing some of these or any of these other projects I'll describe here as reductive drawings. I described this approach in an earlier lecture on value. It's often a good way to quickly get value asserted in the whole drawing. After doing these kinds of exercises, I asked my students at the University of Washington to draw a still life in a complex interior from their imagination. I asked them to invent a room, at least 2 walls meeting in a corner, but the room could also be more elaborate with a back wall, 2 side walls, a floor, and a ceiling. I asked them to imagine a window which is the light source. In the room, there's also a table. On the table is a still life consisting of geometric solids. I also asked them to include a pattern on the floor based on a grid. I asked them to use values so that everything feels three-dimensional, but I also asked them to use value compositionally, so that the objects on the table read as the focal point. Note here how the still life is dominant in scale, elaborate in shape, contains zigzagging diagonals, hinges on the center of the format, and has relatively high contrast. This enables it to dominate the very intricate floor pattern. Also note how the walls and cityscape are handled, all close value. Here we get a very clear mood, an old library mood life. Wonderful stage setting, all those books and other items on the shelves. Each book has a size, shape, specific binding, and spatial orientation. Some are vertical, some horizontal, some sloping diagonally. There's a whole world there, and yet it's all shrouded in mid-grays. That allows the still life table and window events to remain the area of focus. And here's a final example. So many rhyming rectilinear structures, books, tables, and blocks in gridded pattern, all in contrasting scales. The value of the gridded floor patterns beautifully controlled. If the contrast had been too high, it would have been way too attention-getting, but it sits there and plays its role because it exists in close value. Another thing I really like about this drawing is how each book has a real shape and size. Some are vertical, others lean at various angles. For this project, use a good quality paper. Consider its surface, value, and chroma. Making good choices here can really benefit the drawing. A next project is to invent a still life from your imagination, using your knowledge of basic solids and light and shade to construct the drawing. The space, here 2 walls and a tabletop, are easily constructed using linear perspective. The 5 objects are simple combinations or permutations of cones, spheroids, and cylinders. That's not to exclude observation in any of the projects I've just described. If you're drawing the geometric solids and run into a problem, set something up that's similar. Analyze what you're seeing, then go back to your drawing and apply what you've observed. With the 2 other projects, you might want to research a type of room, furniture, window, or a floor pattern. Use online resources, compile your own photographs of things, and collect the kinds of objects you'll need. When using photographs, you want to make sure you're doing just that. Using the photograph, not copying it. I'll give you an example. I want a particular type of window for my drawing. I find a picture of what I want online, but the picture has the window in a wall parallel to the picture plane. I want the window in a side wall. So I take the data about the window type, molding, thickness, etc., and adapt it to my drawing. Some of my students draw still lifes of invented objects. Once you understand form and light, you can draw as if you were playing with clay. In this regard, I'd note that William Bailey doesn't generally set up a still life and make a drawing. Instead, he uses his knowledge of line, shape, volume, and the illusion of space to construct these drawings from his imagination. Similarly, to make this pastel drawing, Norman Lundin didn't set up this table in this room. Instead, he calls on a breadth of knowledge to construct the drawing. That's not to say artists who work this way won't look at a specific cup or picture for reference, or the play of light on a wall, but many drawings people assume are made by direct observation are instead synthesized in the mind of the artist and are worked out on the surface of the page. To conclude, we can wed what we studied earlier about geometric solids and perspective to our knowledge concerning light and shadow to create believable space and volume drawn from our imagination. There's a whole world to explore here.